So continuing our discussion on worship and Acts chapter 2, verse 42, we spent, I've already warned you, we're not going to go through this passage. That's kind of the framework, the outline of the whole series, this whole session. But we'll be going to other passages, certainly. But we spent 2 weeks talking about the word continually. That's almost worthy of Martin Lloyd-Jones. Another 5 or 6 weeks and we'd exhaust the meaning of that word. But the idea of how often we should meet. But I want to move on to the next word, devoting. Now it appears from the structure of the sentence, and even in the English, I'm not trying to pull Greek on you here, but it appears that the word devoting, which is a participle, governs the next 3 items. So they were devoting themselves to 3 things. Actually 4, excuse me. The apostles' teaching. So the idea of devoting to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. One of the, it's relatively minor, it seems inconsequential, but one of the subtle changes that has happened in modern American evangelicalism is the advent of the church office called the worship leader or the worship team. What does that do? What does a worship leader do? In most churches, what does the worship leader do? Music, right? The worship leader leads the music. And what does the worship team do? Perform, yeah. Many churches, they perform, but they perform music. Okay? They play the instruments, they lead the songs from the stage. But what has happened, and that's the reason I call it subtle, is it's pretty much defined worship in our minds with singing. And when we talk about the worship wars, we're talking about the different types of music that different churches use to worship God. But as I mentioned last week, it's not even mentioned here. Singing isn't even mentioned in the 4 items that they devoted themselves to, which again should not in the least be interpreted as singing being less important, but it's almost as if the Holy Spirit anticipated the place that music would usurp in the minds of many.
Laura was just mentioning to me, it's even become a place of division. Like they have a contemporary hour.
Right, you have different services, contemporary, traditional. The traditional is always the earlier one because old people get up earlier. But yeah, it's a divisive thing. But the worship that we see here, if we assume that they are gathered to worship, which I think is a very safe assumption, they are assembling together to be in the presence of God. We talked about the church as a temple, coming together to be in the presence of God. That is worship. And the word devoting, again, I think it's important to recognize that they were not devoting themselves to any one of these items exclusively, but nor did they leave any one of these items out.
It seems like worship, and in terms of music, I'm not defending it, but we are worshiping God because we are the ones that are singing. So we're singing to each other, which most churches don't even talk about, and we're worshiping God. So we are the ones
But that,
when you are preaching, you are lecturing us.
right. But therein lies a problem, but it's a very true one. Okay, what Yuri is saying is that we tend to consider worshiping in music because we're all doing it, which that is not necessarily true in many churches. Okay, that happens to be true of our congregation, but I know that in many churches, most of the singing, and throughout history, most of the singing is done by the choir. But nonetheless, in our context, we consider it worship because we're participating. Now the question is, of these four that are up here, do any of them require the participation of the congregation? Yes. All of them, actually. Okay? It is a real but false perception that we have that the congregation participates in worship when we're singing. But that's not what we read. They were devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, which it's kind of held to fellowship, as a unity. The breaking of bread, that's table fellowship or communion. However you interpret it, it's nonetheless, it's got a corporate context to it. And then prayer. Again, this can all be done singularly. In the Roman Catholic Church, the priest places the wafer on your tongue, and the only thing you do is swallow it. And you don't even get to drink the wine. Okay? I don't know how you do fellowship by yourself, but some people probably pull it off. Again, a lot of churches, even Protestant churches, prayer is a sacerdotal, it is a mediatorial act that is done by the clergy. The senior pastor prays. So yeah, that we do perpetuate this idea that the worship of God is for the most part something that the priesthood does, but then we get to sing. And that I think Yuri's right, that culturally, church culture, that's why music has become so important. Not only that, but also because music is in and of itself a very powerful medium, a very emotional medium, more so than sermons. Okay, sermons don't really get people going like, foot tapping the way a good 50s song will do. But the perception is false. When we read Acts 4 or 2:42, they were devoting themselves. Okay? Now, the they, I think, should be, as you read along, comprehensive, but not, exclusive. So, for example, when it says they had all things in common, it does not mean that it was a socialist commune. They also owned, we read a little bit later, that Barnabas owned a plot of land, and Ananias and Sapphira owned some property. They sold it. They gave half, and that wasn't the problem. The problem was they claimed that what they gave was all of it. Peter makes it very clear that it was entirely under their control throughout the whole process. So you have this, they're all, like we say, meeting day by day. Does that mean every single believer in that whole city met every single day? No, but it did mean that the church assembled all these times and places. When they met from house to house, does it mean that they met in each individual's house every single day? No, it doesn't mean that. So that's what I mean. It's comprehensive, but not exclusive. Okay? So, but the they is a very important word there, a very important pronoun, because it should guide us away from the clergy, laity, the priesthood mediatorial idea that has constantly infiltrated into churches. And it's something that Fellowship Bible Church, even as a model from back in the 70s, was seeking to get away from, to move away from the idea. However, most Fellowship Bible churches, including ours 30 years ago, have a senior pastor. If they're large enough, they have an associate pastor, a pastoral staff, a youth pastor, a pastor of worship, who is the music leader. Okay, so they've got the same pattern that we see in most modern evangelical churches. The word devoting is a significant word. It's not used often in the Bible, but it is used a lot in extra-biblical Greek. It means to persist obstinately in.
Imagine if we all prayed to God like filigree talks to everyone.
I'd rather not. Well, more of a stream of consciousness. And no, that's not a bad idea, the idea of a stream of consciousness praying. I imagine that's how Jesus prayed in his spirit. But to persist obstinately in. The word is, in other words, it's a very strong word. It can be used both positively and negatively, but it means not here and there, not when the mood strikes us. It means something that you are, I guess a modern word would be obsession. It becomes an obsession. If you can think of an obsession, obviously that's a pejorative term, but is an obsession with knowing God's mind a negative concept? You've heard the phrase, he's so heavenly minded, he's no earthly good. Is that even possible? There's something else wrong with the person, but it's not really possible to be so heavenly minded to be no earthly good. Because if you are no earthly good, you cannot be heavenly minded.
The word obstinately makes me think of people who do it purposefully and with discipline.
Yes, that's a good combination of words. Purpose and discipline.
I like the word the American state uses, just steadfastly.
Steadfastly. This word here to persevere. Putting them together, continually persevering, is almost redundant. I mean, it is redundant, because if you're persevering, you're doing it continually. But it's a level of effort. I remember years ago, my brother telling me, this was many, many years ago, he said, you can't expect everyone in the congregation to be as interested in the Word as you are. I think he was wrong. I think he is. If he still believes that, I think he is still wrong. I don't think that anyone in the pastorate has that expectation, but I think the Holy Spirit does. I think what we read about, and we're going to look at this again in the sermon this morning, what we read from the early church and what we read from Paul's writings, especially to Timothy, is an expectation. As he writes to the Corinthians, he says, we have the mind of Christ. Now, what my brother was getting at, well, actually, no, what he said was what he said, but it was pretty much like just expect that the majority of any congregation will be apathetic toward the Word. What happens if the pastor makes that assumption and then guides his ministry from that assumption? He'll either get apathetic or he'll become a pope. Okay, because it will not promote what we're reading here was characteristic of the believers after Pentecost. It will promote a clericalism. So if you just accept that, and usually it's the 80-20, you've heard the 80-20 split, 20% of the people do 80% of the work. So, you expect 20% of the congregation to care about God's Word, and then you basically focus on that 20%. And then the rest of them, you give them a sermon, and then you shake their hand, and they go on their merry way. I don't think that's acceptable.
My three children are very different. Some of them eat very well, some of them do not. I don't ignore the ones that are not eating well.
Right.
I praise the one who is.
Right.
I force the ones who are not eating well to eat because they need that nutrition.
They need it. They need it. Now, what is true is that we cannot expect, and this is where some churches, especially in the Reformed tradition, kind of go overboard, and the Pharisees did as well. We're all gifted differently. So, for example, we cannot expect everyone to become an elder, a pastor, a missionary, or whatever, okay? Some churches believe that, all you have to do is say yes, and you're going to be a missionary. The Spirit is what distributes. So we're not talking about individual giftedness. What we're talking about is hunger, a desire to hear from God through His Word and by His Spirit, to do these things, to persist obstinately in learning, in fellowship, in communion, and in prayer. And I can't see where any of them do not apply to every professed believer. Is that acceptable? I think it is biblical as well as practical. We read it, and when Paul writes about the elders who work hard at preaching and teaching, or he writes about those who receive their income from the Word, that there's definitely, everybody has, in addition to their new life in Christ, they have a life to lead. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7 that he wishes that everyone was unmarried, because then they could devote themselves more exclusively to God and to the church. But that's not the case. And so there is going to be a difference in vocation, but there should not be a difference in expectation.
How is fellowship different than the others?
I'm not really sure. That's why I tend to read this as communion. In the ancient world, it really is the Mediterranean world today, fellowshipping, or in the Baptist world, fellowshipping means a meal. Okay? It was table fellowship. That was the ultimate form of friendship. I do think that fellowship has more of, and this is conjecture, because the words don't really say, but it has more of a horizontal. The breaking of bread has more of a vertical.
It takes fellowship to do all others. It takes fellowship to do...
It takes, yes, but fellowship, it takes fellowship to do all the others, but all the others are components of fellowship.
I was just thinking that perhaps the fellowship here meaning the care for one another outside the meeting.
That would be very contextual to say that fellowship was taking care of one another's needs outside the gathering, because that is exactly what they did. So yes, that is, and we'll try to unpack that word, because I do think it's more than just getting together. And then the difference between 2 and 3 is subtle. Okay, and I don't want to try to make it so. Some people say that Greek is a clear and precise language. Greek is no clearer or more precise than any other human language. There are subtleties in Greek as there are in every other language. So the meaning that Luke had in using these words may not be available to us to know precisely what the differences were. But I think Abe has a very good point that the fellowship didn't stop when the assembly ended, that they continued to take care of one another's needs. So looking at the first, so we're looking at the word devoting, to persist obstinately in. I think we learned a lot about the modern church during the COVID years. And not much that we learned was encouraging. So what we learned for the most part is that the majority of evangelical churches will endeavor to do to the best of their ability whatever the government requires them to do. And they will do it in the name of love. So we have to recognize that that attitude was already latent, was already within the leadership and the congregations before the COVID crisis hit, because the response was fairly immediate. That means that we live in that type of culture within modern evangelicalism. That most of the professing believers that we meet are not, what's the word? They're going to generally fall under two headings. The one is a heading, this is my opinion, a heading of fear. Frankly, I think that COVID scared a lot of people. I find it hard to believe that what was done through careful meditation and thought, but rather was done primarily out of fear. We still see some of that fear residual, around us. People were afraid to get sick and die. But there's another group that we'll be talking about more on Thursday evening, and that is basically rebellious. I will not do it because the government tells me to. Does anybody doubt that there is that attitude in our American churches? I will not do it because the government is the institution telling me to do it. Okay. So you have these two attitudes, fear and rebellion, fear and resistance. Neither one of them are biblical.
Not trying to start a political debate, but it's whoever is the president, if you agree with the president, you're more likely, like with his Democrat or Republican. If you are pro-Republican, you're probably going to be on the side of, I'm going to listen to what the president say, and if it's a Democrat, then you're not.
Yes, that is true, except that much of the COVID era was under a Republican president. And you still had a great deal of resistance to the CDC. You just had a lot of, but you're right, it does largely, it's very political, and it does largely come from, again, it's not, just as with the fear, the resistance is not well thought out, it's more reactionary. But nonetheless, I think, do we all agree that neither one of those is a biblical attitude? We did not continue to meet as a church because we were resisting the government. And we did not cease to meet as a church because we were afraid to get sick and die. We tried to continue to meet because that is, number one, what we were supposed to do, and number two, what in the Lord we desire to do. Right.
If we live stream a sermon, then that covers the bases.
That's a very good point, and I'm glad you brought that out. Devoting themselves to the apostle teaching is the first on the list. Does that make it the most important? That's a rhetorical question. A what's it question. Actually, all of these four, this kind of came out in the discussion about these two, these are all intertwined. Okay? You cannot do these three with that one without these three, okay? They're not really separate activities, but as Abigail was pointing out, many Reformed churches, this is somewhat the characteristic of Reformed churches, and that is the centerpiece of worship is the sermon. Well, it is important. And again, that was a reaction to the Roman Catholic and the medieval centerpiece, which was the Mass, the Eucharist. And it's even in our architecture. You go into a cathedral, and what is front and center is the altar. the pulpit is usually off to the side. If you go into a Protestant church, what's front and center is the pulpit. And if they do have a communion table, it will be in front of it, but often at a lower level. And it's not called an altar. So the idea that even the architecture conveyed the attitude of what is central to worship. For the Roman Catholic, the Mass is central to worship. For the Protestant, especially the Reformed Protestant, the sermon. And so during COVID, you had virtual church, video church, because what's important is the sermon. And as long as you were getting a sermon, well, you didn't have to be together. Okay. You didn't have to fellowship because you were getting fed. You were getting a sermon. That was good enough. And then when they did start to get together, you had to be 6 feet apart, wearing masks. The church Abigail was attending in St. Andrews disallowed singing, but you could hum. I mean, they put more thought into how to obey than they did to how to worship. Okay, and so that's what I'm saying. It really unveiled. It was very revealing of the state of the church.
Well, I think you're talking about the ends of the spectrum, though. I mean, yes, there's fear on one end and there's resistance on the other end, but most of us resided somewhere in the middle. I would
Right.
say 99% of us did. I mean, there were very good reasons to believe that we should resist because of the ridiculousness of the evidence that it was deadly. So I don't know. I mean, bringing out the point that some of us were afraid and some of us were just resisting blindly because it's the government, I think is false. Because most of us are not in the middle.
Yeah, I will accept that those two are extremes, but again, it's my commentary, which is not infallible. But in listening to those churches that did meet, there is a very strong element of resistance to the political authorities. That's something that we actually tried to avoid consciously. In fact, we did not meet for about 6 weeks, trying to see what was going on. But we were anxious every Sunday, the three elders, to get back together, and met and talked each week. And I will say that the political process did have something to do with when we met, because the word was that Governor McMaster was going to reopen something like, I don't know, April 3rd or whatever it was. And we consciously decided to meet before he made his announcement. But I think there are others that do, and I think I'm talking mostly, well, I mean, everybody's experience is different. And what you've heard, people in your family, people in your circle, you're right, these are extremes. I guess what I'm saying is neither element is actually biblical, even the resistance one. But you need to come to Thursday night to hear about that one, okay? But that the reason to continue to worship without fear and regardless of what the government says, either for or against, whether it's Constantine or Nero, the reason is because you are the new humanity. You are the people of God. And you cannot live without one another and Him. So I guess that's what I'm saying. You're right, they're extremes. Some were more fearful, and we see that, but also some were more just plain rebellious, and we see that, and then most of us are somewhere. And I'm not saying that there's no fear. You know, people were dying. People that we know were dying. Okay? People maybe even in our extended families. We were very blessed. We were also blessed in the sense that we live in a very red state. There wasn't much, but nonetheless, we live in a very liberal part of a red state, and there was a lot of murmuring going on, especially on Buist Avenue, when we let out after church and everybody was out talking without masks, enjoying one another's company, you could overhear the comments.
I think we've already kind of gotten to this a bit, but the more rebellious faction, there tended to be the rhetoric of COVID is not that dangerous, this is silly, therefore we should meet. But what if COVID or some other disease really is that dangerous? Do we still meet? I feel like
That was the struggle.
issue. If
Yeah.
it's bubonic plague, living
Yeah.
through the Black Death.
Frankly, if the flu is going through the congregation, the elders may decide not to meet one Sunday. However you feel about that, it's like these things do happen. Okay, and it could have been, it was a very, very powerful form of the flu, and people did die. I'm somewhere in between in the whole.
But it seems to me that we are under direction to follow, to obey the government. As part of our, to a certain point.
To this,
Yes.
yeah.
But I think that it seems to me, and that was just my personal opinion, that if we're given enough time, some people who are not our true remnant decided this is not right. We've got to meet.
Right.
I think the some who are just playing church, they kept on going with the virtual church because they were not really true.
I think it's I think that's what is so disturbing about the whole situation, is that after it became more and more apparent that you could take what were really often just common sense precautions that you would do. Let's say you ran a daycare facility. Hopefully you would clean the tables. When it became apparent that still many churches did not return. And when they did return, they still, they returned in a manner that was, again, fearful or slavishly obedient.
There's still churches that are doing the little communion packets.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Communion packets. And I guess you could replace the holy water with hand sanitizer, right?
I feel like the persisting obstinately is, I think maybe COVID revealed what you're being obstinate towards. And I felt like a lot of churches were being obstinate towards obeying the government, and a lot of churches were being obstinate against obeying the government. And so there was a lot of negative obstinance.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's an excellent point. And that's really the focus of today's study is, what does this mean, persisting obstinately? And then the natural question, what are we persisting obstinately in? Are we persisting obstinately in our disobedience to the government or in the obedience to the government? Or are we persisting, there's a third option, in that, are we persisting obstinately in our fear of dying? Okay? I mean, even someone who is ambivalent towards the government, one way or the other, this is how it was presented to us, is deadly. Okay? And I think that reached kind of a basal emotional level in people. And I think that's what brought out the more interpersonal conflicts. As you see, you'd see people in stores yelling at one another because so-and-so doesn't have a mask on. The government wasn't even being mentioned. They're just afraid of dying.
It puts me in mind of Daniel and his friends. They would not eat the meat, but they were not slavish in eating the meat, and they were not militant in not eating the meat. They ate produce and believed that God would sustain them, and he did.
Right. They were obstinate in obeying the Lord. They would not eat food that the Lord had declared unclean, and he sustained them. And yet, we're not promised that he will sustain us physically in disobeying. Okay? There are millions of Christians who have suffered and died for disobeying the government.
And they said,
Okay?
even if he does not save us.
Yes, they knew. Yeah,
Still good.
right. They knew, even if he does not, nonetheless, he is still good and he is still God. And so even if we did catch COVID and from it die, our obstinate persistence was in obeying the Lord. That's really the focus of the mention of COVID, of course, and I was well aware that that would get off into, that's something. But still, it's going to go down in history as a very revealing era in evangelicalism.
I guess just a couple of the other points up there. I know, having talked with people through work, there were some who were just devastated by not being able to get together with their friends or their church body and express that devastation that they didn't really miss the teaching or breaking bread, but not being able to get together was their thing. So that was obviously what they were persisting in. And you mentioned, or in the past you have mentioned, church you went to where you didn't have communion.
Right.
Bring it to you.
Right, they'll bring it to you.
And I feel like that's another,
Yeah,
COVID aside, that could have been caused by sickness, where you didn't go to church because you were sick, and yet it was so important to the body that they would bring you communion. And I imagine that there were different reactions to COVID that each one focused on something. We've mentioned, hey, we'll live stream a sermon and everybody's good. And I guess you could do a Teams meeting and get everyone to fellowship, although not the same.
right.
And you could distribute communion packets. But at the end
Yeah.
of the day, if we single out any one of these items, are we truly following the apostles' format, the example that they passed down?
What you're pointing out is actually the subject of a very lengthy contemporary debate and analysis, and that is the impact of the technological revolution on our life. Now we're entering into an era where more and more people will be working from home and working remotely. The same is true now in the church. COVID kind of brought that out. We wouldn't have done it otherwise, but we were already doing something a little bit like that in the satellite church movement, where people are coming together as a congregation, but the pastor is not there. He's someplace else, and he'll show up on the screen when it's time for him to bless us with his word. Okay? So the idea of remote congregation was already, again, these things did not just happen. COVID revealed attitudes. I don't know that it made any necessarily, but it certainly revealed many.
Can we go all the way back to Gutenberg? Because now everyone owns a Bible.
Right.
But before you actually had to go to a service.
Right.
Here.
Actually, that's been done, and those of us who are old enough to remember, the same thing was true with the advent of television, and then those of us who are not old enough to remember the advent of telephones. Every time technology has advanced, there will be those who say this is horrible. How many people write letters anymore? Okay. Now, what that's going to do is, in the future, historians are going to have nothing to work with, because the letters of the past are our window, but nonetheless, there's a certain intimacy in letters that you don't get in emails. But now emails have been replaced by texts, and we don't even spell out our words anymore. Oh, okay.
But don't you think, though, I guess my point was, remember, this is a purifying thing.
Yes.
This stuff is God showing his people what it is.
Just as it was in the exile. This is a purifying time. Whenever the church is faced with a surrounding culture that is inimical to faith, that is a purifying time. That's not a pleasant time to live in. Okay. Now, I'm not sure that it's, that all times aren't in some sense purifying, but I think it is harder to live as an evangelical, I mean in the true sense of the word, today than it was 50 years ago. Let me put it this way, there are far fewer cultural supports, okay, in place today for someone who is a devout believer and is persisting obstinately in the word, in fellowship, in communion, in prayer. There are far fewer cultural supports in our world today than in any time in our country's history, certainly, and in some respects for the last 500 years. So yeah, it's very purifying.
It's just like the political climate of wokeism. That is also purifying.
It is.
So then you realize, you know what, I can't do anything about these people. I can't go over there and outvote them or something. It tells me that where my sense of responsibility is to my church, my people, my family.
It's purifying what's going on. Again, hopefully we'll be talking about this on Thursday evenings, the whole thing about wokeness. But keep in mind that that's just the fad du jour. You know, that there's going to be gender fluidity, there's going to be something else. I mean, they're getting wilder. And yet, when you see the churches very quickly accommodating, changing their message just to accommodate whatever's going on in culture, that's a culling effect. Those churches are apostatizing. Okay? I know that sounds very judgmental, but they're very quick to abandon the essence of the gospel in order to accommodate whatever's going around. Okay? And that is very purifying, but that's also what happened in Israel. You know, they did whatever was going on around them, and the prophets constantly harangued them for their unfaithfulness. It is, in a sense, adultery.
I remember a pastor in South Korea during the COVID stuff saying there has been a winnowing effect.
It is winnowing. Yeah, there is a winnowing effect. And I think it's ongoing. I really do. And I think that it was to be expected because, and this is getting into the Thursday night discussion that we've had, the whole process of modernization, the Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, everything has been working against the belief in God in Western society. We're reaping the harvest of seeds that were sown in the 18th century, and we're now seeing the fruit of that in our modern culture.
Among evangelical churches, though, that have an abandoned theology, and I keep thinking of my church in St. Andrews, which is quite evangelical, but they're the ones that, you didn't sing when we got back together, because there's the loss of realization that worship is participatory, church is participatory. It's a very top-down church. Prayers, yes, people from the congregation get up and say the prayers, but those prayers, I am 99.9% sure, are vetted by the senior pastor, or else they are scripted. They're from some catechism. Yes, we sing, but there's a worship band that leads. So even the evangelical churches that understood that we need to be getting together as soon as possible, participation was nice but not crucial.
Yeah, it wasn't an essential element.
Yeah.
I think that to close up today, when we look at this structure of that verse in chapter 2 of Acts, the point I want to leave you with is that none of these are optional. None of them are exclusive. I would say none of them can really be prioritized over the others because they all exist together. And frankly, I think when these are, I don't know, I hate to use the word balance because it seems like, each one even. It's not that necessarily that. But when these are operating in their proper interconnectivity, the response is going to be singing. The response is going to be the lifting up of voices in praise to God, who by his grace and through his Spirit has brought this about. Let's close in prayer. Father, we do thank you for your word and for the depth of it. To even a word shows us both how we ought to worship and then also where we fall short. And we do pray that you would stir in up a spirit of obstinate persistence in our obedience to your word and in our assembling, and not necessarily just physically being together, but as you would have it, worshiping you together in spirit and truth. We ask that you would continue to teach us and fill our hearts with gratitude for your great grace and love.